Yes, the title is Trollope's Griseldas or Too Much Obedience. I don't remember when I first learned that when an author names a fictional character Griselda, it has a very special significance. Certainly when, many years ago, I first read Robertson Davies' novel Tempest Tossed, I was completely oblivious to all the Trollopean references with his character Griselda Webster and her family. Quote, Griselda liked romances of two kinds. If she were not reading Anthony Trollope, whose slow common sense stories and whose staid common sense lovers she greatly admired, she liked spicy tales of the type which usually appear in paper-bound copies, in which bishops are forced to visit nudist camps in their underwear, in which men are changed into women, in which bachelors are surprised in innocent but compromising situations with beautiful girls. Hers was a simple but somewhat ribald mind. She shifted her hips so that the warm water swept over her stomach, which had grown a little chilly. She prodded a chocolate clinically, as it appeared to be a soft center. She popped it in her mouth. She turned a page of The Vicar of Bullhampton, peace settled. End of quote. On rereading Tempest Tossed, I find it has an explicitly acknowledged debt to Framley Parsonage and Griselda Grantley in particular. That both Griseldas are daughters of Anglican clergymen is only the beginning. When Mr. Trollope named a character Griselda, he knew his readers would think of patient Griselda, a character created in the 14th century in the Decameron, a collection of 100 stories by Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian poet and scholar. Many versions of this strange tale followed, operas, novels, and paintings, but Chaucer's The Clerk's Tale, finished about 50 years after Decameron, is probably the most famous. As the story goes, Griselda is a young girl, poor but pure, beautiful and virginal and compliant, who is discovered by Walter, a very noble and wealthy marquis. He asks her to be his bride. But how obedient is she? She must be tested. In his prenup, Walter asked, and this is a quote from Chaucer, quote, "Are you ready to submit with good heart to all my lust, that I may, as seems best to me, make you laugh or feel pain, and you never to grouch about it night or day? Also, when I say yea, you never say nay, neither by word nor frowning countenance." She agreed. And neither by word nor frowning countenance does she grouch, while her husband takes away her children, ostensibly to kill them, repudiates her and sends her back to poverty, then enlists her to help with his new marriage to a young woman who actually turns out to be the daughter supposedly murdered 20 years before. Through all the testing, Griselda remains impassive and uncomplaining, and finally she is rewarded. Her husband declares that she has passed the tests and she is reinstated to her position as a nobleman's wife with all the wealth and status that brings. Whenever Trollope uses the name Griselda, he is deliberately referencing this story, a completely patient, obedient woman who never complains. There are two eponymous Griseldas in Trollope's novels and a few other places where a Griselda or not a Griselda describes a woman's character or behavior. Griselda Grantley, who becomes the Marchioness of Hartletop via her marriage, like the patient Griselda, appears in 8 novels, as often or more than any other character. Who is she? Why is she there? Readers meet her for the first time in The Warden. She is one of 2 daughters of Archdeacon Grantley and his wife Susan. Quote, The two little girls, Florinda and Grizel, were nice little girls enough, but they did not possess the strong, sterling qualities of their brothers. Their voices were not often heard at Plumstead Episcopi. They were bashful and timid by nature, slow to speak before company, even when asked to do so. And though they looked very nice in their clean white muslin frocks and pink sashes, they were but little noticed by the Archdeacon's visitors. Already, her behavior is characteristic of her name. In Barchester Towers, she makes an appearance at Mrs. Proudie's infamous reception. Quote, There came the Archdeacon and his wife with their elder daughter, Griselda, a slim, pale, retiring girl of 17, who kept close to her mother and looked out on the world with quiet, watchful eyes, one who gave the promise of much beauty when the time should have ripened it. Close quote. One of the Proudie daughters, Netta, feels obliged to help Griselda out because nobody has spoken a word to her. Later in the novel, she appears in a brief but touching scene where she and her sister pass judgment on Mr. Arabin, who is a guest in the Archdeacon's house. Quote, Griselda was surprised to find that he looked so young, but she told Florinda, her younger sister, when they had retired for the night, that he did not talk at all like a young man. And she decided, with the authority that 17 has over 16, that he was not at all nice, although his eyes were lovely. As usual, 16 implicitly acceded to the dictum of 17 in such a matter and said that he certainly was not nice. They then branched off on the relative merits of the other clerical bachelors in the vicinity, and both determined without any feeling of jealousy between them that a certain Reverend Augustus Green was by many degrees the most estimable of the lot. Having thus fixedly resolved that the newcomer had nothing about him to shake the preeminence of the exalted Mr. Green, the two girls went to sleep in each other's arms, contented with themselves and the world. Close quote. Griselda Grantley comes into prominence in the novel Framley Parsonage. Her sister, so close to her in age and companionship, has died. Griselda has been put on the marriage market by her mother, Mrs. Susan Grantley. Susan Grantley is friends with Lady Lufton, who is shopping for the perfect bride for her son, already Lord Lufton and head of the family. They have a treaty signed and sealed, metaphorically, of course, quote, and by the terms of this treaty, Griselda Grantley was to become Lady Lufton. Griselda was decidedly a beauty, but somewhat statuesque in her loveliness. Her forehead was high and white, but perhaps too like marble to gratify the taste of those who are fond of flesh and blood. Her eyes were large and exquisitely formed, but they seldom showed much emotion. She indeed was impassive herself and betrayed but little of her feelings. Close quote. Does she have feelings? Lucy Robarts, her rival for Lord Lufton, describes Griselda as, quote, a mere automaton, cold, lifeless, spiritless, even vapid. There is, I believe, nothing in her mentally, whatever may be her moral excellences. To me, she is more absolutely like a statue than any other human being I ever saw. To sit still and be admired is all that she desires, and if she cannot get that, to sit still and not be admired would almost suffice for her. Close quote. If Griselda is such a blank, why does she take up so much space in this novel? She is definitely a foil for the dynamic and feisty Lucy. This literary term, foil, is named after an old jewelry trick of setting a gem on a foil base to enhance its shine. And Griselda Grantley provides a perfectly colorless and shiny surface to reflect the brilliant jewel that is Lucy. But is that all there is? Occasionally, through some very tiny cracks in her shiny blank surface, we get glimpses of the girl inside. When her father, Archdeacon Grantley, is lobbying for an appointment as a bishop, she speaks up, quote, "But Mama, a bishop of Westminster will be higher than a bishop of Barchester, won't he? I should so like to be able to snub those Miss Proudies." It will therefore be seen that there were matters on which even Griselda Grantley could be animated. Like the rest of her family, she was devoted to the church. Close quote. When her mother is attempting to learn if any attachment is happening between Griselda and Lord Lufton, Griselda shows an astute understanding of Lord Lufton's feelings, probably better than he knows himself. Quote, "Lord Lufton thinks a great deal more of Lucy Robarts than he does of anyone else, I believe," said Griselda, showing now some little animation by her manner. "Dumpy little black thing that she is," end quote. Griselda plays piano very well and thoroughly enjoys dancing. When, much to Mrs. Proudy's consternation, Miss Dunstable has the temerity to include dancing in her conversazione, Griselda participates with enthusiasm. Quote, "In society, Griselda's toes were much more serviceable to her than her tongue, and she was to be won by a rapid twirl, much more, probably, than by a soft word." Close quote. Griselda has another follower, one Lord Dumbello. He is the eldest son and heir to the Marquis of Hartletop, a very rich nobleman who is now very feeble. His mother, Lady Hartletop, is no better than she should be, having been quite openly involved in a love affair with the Duke of Omnium for many years. That's the old Duke, that is. The Trollopean web can get quite complex. Dumbello lives up to his name in more ways than one. He is a man of very few words. But during the rapid twirling at Miss Dunstable's conversazione, he becomes engaged to Griselda Grantley. Griselda's mother, Susan Grantley, is elated. Griselda's surface remains unruffled. There are hints that her new fiancé may have at least some of the bad qualities of Walter in the Clerk's Tale. Quote, "Lord Dumbello was a man who had a will of his own, as the Grantleys boasted amongst themselves. Poor Griselda, the day may perhaps come when this fact of her lord's masterful way may not be to her a matter of much boasting." Close quote. Her Aunt Eleanor expresses concern for Griselda's heart. Will she be happy? Her grandfather, our dear Mr. Harding, with open affection that is not reciprocated, tells her, quote, "You are going to be a great lady, Grizzy." "Humph," said she. What was she to say when so addressed? "And I hope you will be happy and make others happy." "I hope I shall," said she, "but when he gets her title wrong, she will never be a duchess, only a marchioness." She scoffs at him and he goes away. Her shiny surface repels genuine affection. There's a wonderful little hitch in the plans when Dumbello runs away to Paris and Archdeacon Grantley follows him and brings him back to Plumstead to be married. And, quote, "Dumbello went through his work like a man," close quote. The last chapter of Framley Parsonage is delightfully titled, "How They Were All Married, Had 2 Children, and Lived Happily Ever After." Lady Hartletop tells her paramour, the Duke of Omnium, quote, "She sees all that she ought to see and nothing that she ought not." End of quote. The implication is that only a Dumbello would want to marry a Griselda. No man with any sense and or sensibility wants a woman with no personality, no passions, no voice of her own. But perhaps they are perfectly matched. But, the narrator tells us, a handsome woman at the head of your table who knows how to dress and how to sit and how to get in and out of her carriage, who will not disgrace her lord by her ignorance or fret him by her coquetry or disparage him by her talent. How beautiful a thing it is. For my part, says the narrator, I think that Griselda Grantley was born to be the wife of a great English peer. Close quote. And she is very successful in that role. She has the honor of being the person who introduces readers of Trollope's novels to the illustrious Plantagenet Palliser. In the eponymous chapter 23 of The Small House at Allington, Lady de Courcy has pulled off a society coup by inviting both Mr. Palliser and Lady Dumbello, Griselda Grantley as was, to Courcy Castle, and letting each know the other was invited. Now, this is the same house party where Adolphus Crosbie denies and jilts Lily Dale. In my notes, I had written the initials LD. And my first thought on seeing those initials was Lily Dale. But no, I was referring to another LD, Lady Dumbello. I suggest that the parallel here is intentional. In fact, after describing a very hilarious non-scene between Plantagenet and Griselda, we are told, quote, "There had not been much that was dangerous in the conversation between Mr. Palliser and Lady Dumbello, but I cannot say the same as to that which was going on at the same moment between Crosbie and Lady Alexandrina," close quote. And in the next scene, Crosbie proposes to Alexandrina. In the ensuing debacle, readers cannot be blamed for forgetting all about Griselda. But 20 chapters later, Mr. Palliser is taken to task by his uncle, the Duke of Omnium, for Plantagenet's rather pallid pursuit of Griselda. Quote, "I don't suppose there is much in it," began the Duke, "but people are talking about you and Lady Dumbello." "Upon my word, people are very kind." And Mr. Palliser bethought himself of the fact, for it certainly was a fact, that people for a great many years had talked about his uncle and Lady Dumbello's mother-in-law. End of quote. Lady Hartletop and the old Duke have been an item for many years. And, quote, "The Duke intended his nephew to understand that he was quite at liberty to take away any other gentleman's wife, but that he was not at liberty to give occasion even for a surmise that he wanted to take Lord Dumbello's wife," close quote. His uncle threatens to cut off his allowance and even disinherit him if he continues to see LD, Lady Dumbello, that is. Perhaps it is this threat that motivates Plantagenet to increase his pursuit, for it's difficult to understand what he sees in our Griselda. But he is 25 years old, though, and, quote, "Since he had been told that Lady Dumbello smiled upon him, he had certainly thought more about her smiles than had been good for his statistics. It seemed as though a new vein in his body had been brought into use and that blood was running where blood had never run before," close quote. Even though he is prepared to disobey his uncle, Mr. Palliser makes very little headway towards tenderness in his brief and boring conversation with LD. Too bad there was no dancing at any of the gatherings where he made the attempt. But the gossip is put about that Griselda is going to leave Lord Dumbello and run away with Mr. Palliser, and Griselda's father and mother are in much distress. How much blame can be placed on her mother, Susan, for the woman that Griselda has become? Griselda was a shy, quiet, beautiful girl, very close to her sister, and then her sister dies. Her mother educates Griselda to make the most of her physical beauty. Piano lessons, dancing lessons, hairdressing, and costuming lessons. As Lady Dumbello, she now moves in high circles where adultery is common. Mrs. Grantley, quote, walked out alone among the tombs of the neighboring churchyard and stood over the grave in which had been laid the body of her other daughter. Could it be that the fate of that one had been the happier? Close quote. She writes a very moving letter to her daughter, full of honest concern and endearments, warning her of the rumors that are circulating. Griselda has all the savvy with regards to society and the patriarchy that she needs to succeed. She uses her mother's letter as a tool to talk to her husband about the rumors, as though she had no awareness of them. And he admits that he has been made jealous, not by her, but by, quote, fools and brutes that have whispered things that have vexed me. They may whisper till the devil fetches them, but they shan't annoy me again. Give me a kiss, my girl. And he absolutely put out his arms and embraced her, close quote, and gives her a new necklace. Griselda's reply to her mother is very cool. All is well, come for a visit. High bonnets have gone out of fashion. Susan Grantley is relieved, but somehow still upset. Quote, she had thrown all her heart into that which she had written, but in the words which her child had written, not a vestige of heart was to be found. In that reconciling of God and Mammon, which Mrs. Grantley had carried on so successfully in the education of her daughter, the organ had not been required and had become withered, if not defunct, through want of use, close quote. For any Griselda, the instinctive concealment of her innermost fears and thoughts exacts a heavy personal price, a withered heart. Mr. Palliser is saved from himself as Griselda firmly rebuffs his attentions that very night at another of Lady de Courcy's parties. Soon after this, the Duke of Omnium arranges a marriage for his nephew with a woman who is definitely no Griselda. Although their names sound alike, quote, the Lady Glencora was small in stature, and her happy round face lacked, perhaps, the highest grace of female beauty. But there was ever a smile upon it, at which it was very pleasant to look. And the intense interest with which she would dance and talk and follow up every amusement that was offered her was very charming. Griselda provides a foil for Glencora's sparkle. By the time Griselda makes her next appearance in the last chronicle of Barsetshire, Lord Dumbello has become the Marquis of Hartletop, making her a marchioness, and she has a little Dumbello of her own. Near the beginning of the novel, she condescends to lay her head for 2 nights on the parsonage pillows and offers advice to her mother and father, Susan and Archdeacon Grantley, on what they can do to prevent her brother, Henry, Major Grantley, from marrying Grace Crawley, daughter of the very poor and very proud Reverend Josiah Crawley. Once again, Griselda is the foil next to which the glow of the intelligent, loving, and passionate Grace shines more brightly. But for me, Griselda's saddest action is her rejection of her grandfather, our beloved Mr. Harding. Back in Framley Parsonage, she snubs him as he offers his warm congratulations on her engagement to Dumbello. Now that she is Marchioness of Hartletop, she specifically requests that her grandfather not be invited to the family dinner, causing her mother Susan to weep in despair. Having served as a foil for Lucy Robarts, Lady Glencora, and Grace Crawley, Griselda serves in this role once again at the first meeting between Phineas Finn and Madame Max Goesler. This pivotal scene in Phineas's story occurs at a dinner party given by Lady Glencora, where Mr. Palliser, Phineas, Griselda, and Madame Max are seated together. Madame Max, brilliant in black with her ruby silk traceries and ruby necklace, bracelets, and earrings, engages Phineas and even Mr. Palliser with her outspoken political views, while, quote, during this conversation, Lady Hartletop sat as though no word of it reached her ears. She did not understand Madame Max Goesler and by no means loved her. End of quote. When there is a lull in the conversation, Phineas says a word to Lady Hartletop, but she only bowed her head gracefully. What a contrast. If you don't know Madame Max, you have a lot of fun ahead of you. Turning to the novel, Miss Mackenzie, in the strange chapter titled The Negro Soldier's Orphan Bazaar, the two eponymous Griseldas almost meet. Griselda, Marchioness of Hartletop, makes another cameo appearance, and she is still, quote, a young woman who knew her right hand from her left under all circumstances and who never made any mistakes. This fundraiser is the London Society event of the season. Only women considered proper for such an event would be asked to operate a booth. Along with Griselda Grantley, as was, booths are allocated to several of our old acquaintances. The Duchess of St. Bungay, Mrs. Conway Sparks, remember the spiteful poetess, and the Lady Glencora Palliser. Now Lady Glencora has taken up the cause of the modern Griselda, Margaret Mackenzie, as she is being harassed from all sides in her quest for a marriage partner. Glencora has insisted that the Mackenzie women bring Margaret to serve with them in their booth. But what if she won't come, says Margaret's cousin Clara. Griseldas are made to do anything, says Lady Glen. And so Margaret is spruced up in a very pretty gown and bonnet and serves at a booth in the same large hall as Griselda Grantley. But sadly, these two different Griseldas are destined never to compare notes. In this very bizarre chapter, setting the bacchanalian mood with her rambunctious bevy of young ladies is a new character, Mrs. Chaucer Munro. She enters the story just as everyone is referring to Margaret as Griselda, yet another allusion to the patient Griselda in the Clark's Tale. Miss Mackenzie was not always a Griselda. For the first 36 years of her life, she lives as a Mariana in a moated grange, very much isolated, while caring for an ailing father and then a brother. During this time of drudgery, though, quote, Margaret had written her thoughts and feelings, hundreds of rhymes which had never met any eye but her own, and outspoken words of love contained in letters which had never been sent or been intended to be sent to any destination. She developed a very rich life in her imagination. When her brother dies, she inherits his estate, busts out of her moated grange, and goes in search of a love life. Primarily because of her money, she attracts several suitors, 3 of whom are named Handcock, Rub, and Ball. Could Mr. Trollope be any more clear? Margaret is in search of sexual love. After many challenges in this quest, she accepts an offer of marriage from John Ball, her widowed cousin with 8 children. In his proposal, he echoes the abusive Walter of the patient Griselda story when he says, quote, "Of course, there may be something disagreeable said before we all shake down happily in our places, but I shall look to you, Margaret, to be firm." "I shall be firm," she says, "if you are." Close quote. There is some power in obedience. When her aunt, John Ball's mother, demands that she renounce the engagement, she replies, quote, "All that I once thought mine is now his, and I demand nothing from him. But when he asked me to be his wife, he told me to be firm, and in that I will obey him. He may renounce me, and I shall have nothing with which to reproach him, but I will never renounce him, never." And then the modern Griselda, who had been thus galvanized into vitality, stood over her aunt in a mood that was almost triumphant. Close quote. So Miss Mackenzie, the so-called modern Griselda, does get angry and stand up for herself. She does have feelings and expresses them clearly. The narrator tells us she was no coward. Indeed, a true Griselda can hardly be a coward. But over and over, she thinks of others before herself. Once she has agreed to marry, even though her intended fails to stand by her time after time, she remains firm. It is her husband who is at fault, never her. She remains open and honest while staying very humble as a Griselda. I found another reference to Griselda in a conversation between Emily Trevelyan and her sister Nora in He Knew He Was Right. Near the beginning of the quarrel between Emily and her husband, and before the damage is irretrievable, Nora is trying to persuade Emily to accede to Louis Trevelyan's demands concerning the infamous and delightful Colonel Osborne. "Am I to be trampled on," says Emily, "and to endure any insult and any names? You yourself, you would be a Griselda, I suppose." "I don't want to talk about myself," said Nora, "nor about Griselda. But I know that, however unreasonable it may seem, you had better give way to him now and tell him what was in that note to Colonel Osborne." Close quote. But Emily refuses to be obedient, ever. There are 3 other marriage plots in this novel that result in happy companionate marriages, but in each case, the men are described as sweet, something Louis Trevelyan never was. And every one of the other women agrees to be obedient, and as far as we follow them, carry out their promise. In Chaucer's The Clerk's Tale, after the happy ending, when Griselda is reinstated as Marchioness, yes, very much like Griselda Grantley, a figure called Chaucer's envoy steps in with his authorial intrusion and emphasizes what we have figured out for ourselves from this story. Extreme patient obedience in the face of an abusive husband is not an ideal that is good to emulate. Instead, quote, "Follow Echo, who holds no silence, but ever answers in reply. Be not fooled because of your innocence, but sharply take the governance to yourself. Imprint well this lesson in your mind, since it may work to the benefit of all." And yet, Nora Rowley and Margaret Mackenzie and many other obedient women in Trollope do make marriages that bring them joy. We hope. The logo for the Women in Trollope conference last September shows Florence Burton, the ingenue in Trollope's novel The Claverings. This portrait is a detail from an illustration titled Florence Burton packs up a packet. Drawn by Mary Ellen Edwards, one of the few female illustrators prominent in the 19th century. In this scene, Florence is very melancholy because, faithful and sweet as she is, she has good reason to believe her fiancé has jilted her for a much less faithful and sweet rival. Quote, "Oh, the misery of packing up such a parcel. The feeling with which a woman does it is never encountered by a man. He chucks the things together in wrath. The lock of hair, the letters in the pretty Italian hand that have taken so much happy care in the writing, the jeweled shirt studs which were first put in by the fingers that gave them. They are thrown together and given to some other woman to deliver. But the girl lingers over her torture. She reads the letters again. She thinks of the moments of bliss which each little toy has given. She would fain keep one small thing, the smallest of them all, until a feeling of maidenly reserve constrains her at last, and the coveted trifle with careful, painstaking fingers is put with the rest, and the parcel made complete, and the address is written with precision." Close quote. Although she is never explicitly called Griselda, Florence does have a tendency to trust and to accept neglect and philandering on the part of her lover with patience and without complaining. Does she have the desirable amount of obedience? Trollope's young women characters are usually vividly portrayed. Unique, believable, three-dimensional. Some are tragic, some are annoying, some make bad choices. The ones who find happiness find it in a marriage where sexual love plays a major role. Marriage was very much a prison for a woman in Victorian England, so the trick, while you still had a choice, was to choose your prison guard carefully. A man with whom you could enjoy your conjugal obligations at least some of the time. A man who would not treat you as Walter treated Griselda in the original Patient Griselda story. But marriage included an expectation, a promise that the woman would obey her lord and master. For women in Trollope, can there be too much obedience? Let's return to Framley Parsonage, as is it always fun to do. The narrator tells us, quote, "The species of power in young ladies which Lady Lufton most admired was the inertia belonging to beautiful and dignified reticence. Of this poor Lucy had none." End quote. Lucy Robarts is too lively, too small, too brown, too outspoken, too demonstrative to be her son's wife. Lucy learns as the novel progresses the right amount of deference and self-suppression necessary to mimic feminine obedience, while continuing to think and feel with all her lively strength. Margaret Mackenzie does almost the same thing. She is a modern Griselda, with more self-suppression and patience than Lucy, but perhaps with a stronger inner life, a stronger sense of self. Griselda Grantley has taken the ideal of feminine obedience too far, like her namesake. Her quiescence and carefully cultivated beauty give her an appearance of strength, but she has no feelings and thoughts to suppress. She provides the perfectly flat, shiny surface as the foil to effectively display all the brilliant facets of the truly feminine woman she sits next to. Lucy Robarts, Lady Glencora, Grace Crawley, and Madame Max Goesler. I feel very sad for Griselda. Any woman who loved to dance the way she did must have had the potential for love. Thank you.